Hello, everyone. And I would like to start the way, gosh, I always start meetings here and everywhere with is just a little bit of time for us to tune into ourselves and center. So if you'll all join me to just start with just sensing where you are with all of the senses that come to mind for feeling into your environment, where you are, what you see, what you're sitting on, where the ceiling or the sky are, and what's underneath you. Just beginning to feel your weight drop into wherever you are perched. And then tuning into the inside. If it feels comfortable to close your eyes or let them go soft focus. And begin to notice what's going on inside of you. Your breathing is always a good place to start. Just noticing how your breath is supporting you and seeing if there are any shifts in your breath, your breathing that would feel supportive. Maybe breathing down into your belly, expanding the diaphragm, maybe expanding the lungs to the sides and back, as well as the front. Just finding ease in your breath. And then noticing if there's something in your body that might like to happen. Maybe something wants to shift, find the right position. Maybe something wants to roll around or stretch or yawn or twist. It's whatever might bring you home to your body right here and now. And when you're ready, you can come back to our group here, and I will dive into what I'm going to share today. Well, I wanted to start with just a little bit of the agenda. I'm going to do a little welcome and introduction. That was the welcome. And I'm going to do a little more introduction. And then talk about my own connection to trance and hypnosis. How did I get to this work? And then into what I've learned about the way that I work with it, and a little bit of Stephen Gilligan's trance and creative mind work, because that's some of my background and training. And then talk a little bit about meditation, mindfulness, and trance, and those terms and how they may be different and have overlapping aspects. And then a little bit about the guide and the state of consciousness of whoever's guiding the trance. And then a little about sacred space, and then we'll be done. So I wanted to talk first about how I got into this. And I got in through the realm of dance. These are actually all pictures of my teaching over the many, many years. There's two of them in there when I was, I think, all of maybe 15 or 16 and leading creative dance classes for kids. So I've been in that role of working with creativity and movement for most of my life. And at first, I was apprenticing with my mom. That's my mom over on the right in that black and white picture on the left. That's me over on the left, and my sister in the middle with the little ones that we were moving with, playing with. Um, I I started out apprenticing with her to teach the creative dance classes because I was really not ready to teach technique dance classes, but teaching the kids was a whole nother thing. And it really involved more about connecting with them and working with the group energy that was there and opening up a space for their creativity. So that has been the basis of my work all along. These other pictures are from work that I've done teaching about the chakra system, which is where I started to really work with trance and the realm of opening a space for people to explore a particular topic, in this case, or aspect of life through going deep, through trance. I think at first I didn't even know what the right terminology was for what I was doing. I just knew that I wanted to open a space where people weren't just listening cognitively to information about the chakra system of the body and being, but we're actually getting to have an experience. So my teaching is really what got me into it, but I realized at a certain point that I probably should learn a little more about the official work of hypnosis. So I went off and studied with Stephen Gilligan and actually found from the very beginning that my work with movement was a wonderful counterpart to his work with deep trance. There was one point where um, he had asked me to lead a movement piece before we did some work in triads with trance. And he wanted me to help get people centered and connected before we did that. And as we watched people moving, following my guidance, he leaned over and said to me, "You know, I think that we've both come at this from completely different angles. It's like you came from dance and movement into this trance work. I went to trance because I was so disconnected from my body, and that was a way for me to explore inwards without having to deal with my body. But bringing the two together really worked very well. So what I started to realize was that I was I was doing something that helped people open to what we might call inner listening. That I was hoping to get people to open a connection to realms beyond their ordinary consciousness. Even with kids, you don't just get the kids in the room and say, okay, let's move like trees with the wind on them. It's like, nobody's going to go there at first. We're all very bound by the directions we've been given about how to be in the world, which are usually not very creative. They're fairly rigid. They're like, you walk into the room and you sit on the chairs and it's all very regimented in a way. And we don't even think about that. We've been trained from such an early age. I love I love sometimes being in a bank or a post office, standing in line, and you see a parent with their kids, and we're all standing, us adults, we're standing in a line the way you're supposed to stand in the post office or bank. And the kids, they haven't learned yet that they're not supposed to be in the space however they want to be. And they're crawling under tables and they're, climbing on things, and they are exploring with an opened up awareness of what's around them and a sense that they can use their bodies to explore that space in a way that we have learned by the time we're adults, certainly, that we're not supposed to do. It's just inappropriate. Everyone will stare. We will be rejected. There's lots of reasons why we don't do those things, but we don't. And so when someone comes into a workshop or a session with me, and I want to be able to bring them into that inner listening space, I can't just say, oh, let's just do some inner listening now. It's the same objection that I often have to, it's not really an objection, but often people will say, let's do some hypnosis. And the best way of shifting consciousness isn't necessarily by telling the cognitive mind that we're going to do that. Because often it's going to hang on when we tell it that we're going to do that. But I wouldn't say I'm tricking people into opening up to a different space, but in a way, I'm inviting them into a different space by shifting my language, shifting my tone, shifting the pacing that I use. All of those things begin to shift something without my ever saying we're going to do something that changes your consciousness into a non-ordinary state of consciousness. What I'm trying to do, back to inner listening here, is create a conduit for expression of the unconscious information about the self that is really available to us once we turn inside and start looking. You may have even noticed that yourself as we started today. When we start by tuning into what's outside of ourselves, it's a really different experience when we then say, okay, let's pay attention now to what's inside. And all of a sudden, we're aware of things that we really weren't paying attention to before. And that shift is the beginning of that inner listening process. It actually doesn't take that long to open up that channel for some inner listening. I really love this quote from Harman and Reingold. It's a state in which the floodgates of thought seem suddenly thrown open, and profound ideas and images, often solutions to our deepest problems, questions about life, our work, our relationship to the universe around us, they're all revealed. And they were there all along. Sometimes they come out in our dreams, but they're usually not available to us as we're going through our daily life. So for me, creative movement exercises have been that practice of inner listening, and it's how I've guided people into that inner listening, but it's definitely not the only one. But since those channels are often blocked in order to repress or suppress emotions that can feel just too intense to find a place in our ordinary consciousness, it requires creating enough of a safe space and enough trust to be able to open that space to things that might not be all that comfortable if they came up in daily life. So what I'm hoping for is transformative experiences, and it's not always a big transformative experience. It can be something like a very small revelation of something that's meaningful to someone that can come out in the middle of a movement session or a creative arts session or just a session where we're doing some inner exploring, some inner listening. But what I'm looking for are shifts in perspective and a sense of some kind of a change that will stay with me. It's not just a change that happens in that moment of having shifted to a non-ordinary state of consciousness. It's a change that once I've opened to that and something new comes through from deep inside me, I might be able to keep that shift and begin to see the world in a different way afterwards because I have access to that piece of something from deep inside that I had not known about myself before. So how do we move into that creative consciousness is what I like to call it. That state of consciousness where transformation or creativity can occur, where we're creating a safe, generative field in which to rest and to explore. Talking about creativity, not necessarily as creating masterpieces, but as the everyday kind of creativity where we're adapting flexibly to the changing environments that we live in and that we experience in life. Sometimes that means working with symptoms that have come up, and that is often what brings people to therapy or hypnosis. Something is not okay. Something feels like it's in the way of us moving towards what we want to in our lives. So there may be behavior or physical phenomena that we haven't consciously chosen to have. And that's what brings us into the willingness to try something new here. And it's not just therapy or coaching sessions or hypnosis sessions that people come to with that kind of a hope. Often they'll come to a workshop. And maybe they come to the workshop. I've certainly had this a lot. People come to a workshop that is going to get them some CEs for their work as a therapist or whatever it is they're doing. But then when we go around the room and say, what brought you here? It's not usually about wanting to learn the skills as much as it is wanting to have the experience themselves. It's like, I came because, yes, I can use these CEs, but I was really hoping to fill in the blank. There was something in their own lives that they're hoping is going to shift. So those kinds of classes and workshops have often been a real opportunity to connect with those parts of ourselves that have information that can help us to shift and transform. For me, movement has been a really wonderful way to approach that. So that's often my basis for talking about all of this, but it is, again, not the only way. So I want to bring in some of the concepts that I have found so useful in Stephen Gilligan's work. And he talks about the generative self, that we're looking to access the part of us that can be generative, that can create newness, that can move us forward, that is not in a stuck place. And the generative self arises when there's an integrated and resonant relationship between the three minds that he talks about. These days, he's talking less about these three minds and has a whole lot more to where he's going now that he's talking about creative mind. But I have found that these three are a really good, just a handy way to think about the different parts that we're working with when we're moving into this kind of creative consciousness or generative self. One is the somatic mind, the body mind, the felt sense. It's where I try to get us shifted into from the very beginning. It's like, can we begin to pay attention to what's going on in the body? Because there is so much information that's there. And how do we do that? By relaxing, by deepening, absorbing, connecting. And we use play, because that playfulness, that can open us to some of those felt senses. Then there's the cognitive mind. We all know the cognitive mind. It's where we live most of the time. It's where we spend our time on the computer mostly. It's where we are often when we're reading, although we may drift into a little bit more of a flow state when we're working with what's coming through in words that we're reading that touches us in a different place. Like reading poetry, for example, may take us to a very different place than just the intellect. But the cognitive mind works with narrative, works with story, and we're not leaving it behind when we do this kind of creative consciousness work. It's included, but we want it to not be the only part of our mind that's present. We want to be able to engage with curiosity and with sponsorship, which is a whole nother concept that I won't spend lots of time with, but it's one that Steve Gilligan brought in a lot, the idea of sponsorship as being kind of a mentorship, a holding for a younger part or a neglected part. So when we talk about sponsorship for ourselves, we're talking about bringing a warm, opening, accepting state to the various things that exist inside of us, including the ones that are sometimes a little harder to be with. We're trying to, in the cognitive mind, hold multiple frames and accept and utilize what is there to go beyond what is there. And that beyond can take us to the field mind. And the field mind has a lot of different aspects to it, some of which can be challenging, difficult. The field mind includes all the things that have been told to us by society, by our families, all of that that originates externally, but is now part of what we consider ourselves, but it is beyond our own individual self. But it also includes archetypal realm. It includes our connection to divinity. It includes a lot of different aspects. So that field mind, which is always there, can be a real resource. It can also be a challenge. But it involves relational communities. It involves people and community that have information to offer to us that comes from beyond just our own individual self. So these are the three minds that Steve Gilligan brings in that I find really useful to think about when I'm thinking about opening a space for creative consciousness, because I want to include all of them. Steve these days works a lot with the two states, one of which is the one you want to move towards to do this kind of creative work, and the other being the one that you want to move out of. So we'll start with the one we want to move towards, which he calls the coach state. Coach standing for centered, open, aware, connected, and hospitable or holding. So often, if you're hanging around with folks who have been studying with Steve Gilligan, they'll talk about let's get into a coach state. And that's shorthand for all of this, shorthand for what might be considered an induction into a more relaxed state. What we're trying to move out of is what he calls the crash state, which is really about feeling isolated and disconnected from ourselves and from everything else. Contracted, reactive, analysis paralysis, where we're caught in circles in our brains, separated and hurting or hating. And this all comes from his creative mind work. If you're ever looking for some interesting exploration, his work is definitely worth exploring. There's so much more to it, but these are some simple concepts that he likes to work with and that I find useful. Again, from his creative mind work, the three goals of creative mind, and I would say his creative mind is very close to what I've been calling creative consciousness, to become deeply aware that sustainable happiness and growth is realized from positive interconnectedness, and that persistent suffering and stuckness reflect that isolated disconnectedness of the crash state. Right. And then to develop and maintain the multi-level patterns of positive interconnectedness that allow sustainable creativity. And to identify and transform the multiple levels of chronic disconnection and dissociation that underlie our suffering and stuckness. And by that, he's not just talking about our individual suffering and stuckness. He's talking about societal suffering and stuckness. He really sees a lot of this work as not just about an individual working with symptoms to feel better in the world, but about what's needed in the world in general for us all to move past the suffering and stuckness that are prevalent these days. So Steve talks about trance, and I really have appreciated that, talking about trance rather than talking about hypnosis, although, we're kind of in the same realm. And his background is all about hypnosis. He was one of the young ones who was sitting at the feet of Milton Erickson for quite a long time at the end of Milton Erickson's life and absorbing all that Erickson had to give. And each one of those students went off and kind of pulled out different pieces of what Erickson was doing as their main work. But I've very much appreciated how Steve has worked with it, but he has moved away from using the term hypnosis very much. He talks about trance as being, well, let's see. He talks about it as being a natural, creative, and generative state of consciousness. It's available to everyone. You don't have to go into a specific state of hypnosis to be able to move into a very gentle trance state that's more like a state of flow. And that Steve's sense of hypnosis is that it's too often associated with there being a hypnotist or hypnotherapist, someone who is doing it to you, who is the expert, who is guiding you, who is the one who's holding the control, rather than the person who is having the experience being the guide of their own experience, which is not to say that it doesn't help to have someone guide us first so that we can learn how to get there. But in the end, even the guide can guide in a way that allows the person who's having the experience to have a lot more control and ability to move within that trance state in a way that is most meaningful for them. I can speak to that from my own experience of trying to guide a little bit too much. I remember this particular one has stuck with me so strongly. I had a client who would come in and spend about a half hour or so talking about her week and everything that had happened. It was really important for her to tell me the stories. And then based on what had come up for her, we would do some deep work. We would do trance work. And there was one time where she had talked about going back to visit family in a wintry state, a state where there was going to be lots of snow, rather than here in California where we are, where there was not any snow at the time. And when we got to doing that trance work, I guided her into my own sense of what it meant to go back to the snow, right? Which was kind of about sitting by the fire and drinking hot chocolate and, staying warm and cozy inside while the snow was going on out there. And thank goodness we had developed enough trust in the relationship that she was able to tell me when we were done that that was completely wrong. It was like really not speaking to what snow was for her. It was about skiing. It was about the sun on her as she would soar down the mountain in the snow. And gosh, that was such a different image than where I went with snowy, wintry place to be. It was a real reminder that using the images that are meaningful to me is not necessarily going to speak to the person that I'm working with because we have different frames of reference for things. And if I have not first determined a lot more about what their resources are and what's important to them and what can be supportive for them, I'm not necessarily going to take them to the right place when I am guiding them. So better, I have learned to open a space where I may bring in a few images here and there, but they're very loosely presented. So they leave a lot of room for people to work with them in the way that's appropriate. In the best of circumstances, I can get some feedback from them about how they're experiencing where we're going. And then I can shift and move to go with where they are guiding me to where the important information is for them, where the important realm is for them to explore. So yeah, this slide about meditation and mindfulness and trance, it's one of the biggest questions I often have when I'm teaching is what's the difference between these? So looking at meditation, which has a variety of ways that we can do what we call meditation, some of which we may not even call them meditation when we're doing them, but they do take us into a state that's very similar to that. Mindfulness has a very specific meaning, and yet it's been kind of turned into the all-purpose way of talking about doing anything that's meditative. It's like, oh, mindfulness, yes. But it really is a very specific process in itself. And then trance, which I would talk about as a flow state that connects conscious and unconscious minds and is not so much about controlling, but about exploring. So my thoughts on trance here, that it's a natural learning state. It is a non-ordinary state of consciousness. It involves connection with an intelligence that's inside us other than the conscious ego or the cognitive self. Steve often talks about how there's a biological need for trance. And if we don't find our way to getting into that kind of a flow state of creative consciousness, you might say, we're going to find some other way to trance out, to watch TV, to use drugs. There's lots of ways that people find to get themselves into that state if we're not doing it in a way that allows us to enter it for for healthy exploration and for generative use rather than just to numb out. Um, it's a way of relating to the deep parts of ourselves and connecting to a presence inside that we don't often have access to in our ordinary states of consciousness. And it's a way of holding opposites, um, to be able to experience paradoxical ideas in ways that don't conflict, but that can begin to interweave, which is where some of our creative solutions can come from. Um, we're talking here about trance to enter the world rather than to escape, and to recognize when intellect is holding us back and find a way to open to that deeper intelligence. And I love this little saying that I actually don't know where it was that Erickson said this, but Steve uh, often brings it in his teaching, which is that Erickson said to do good hypnosis, you have to violate a few social rules and taboos. And often we just have very specific ways that it's okay to talk to people. And when we go deeper, if we probe or we open a space that's beyond that, it's just doesn't feel like it's appropriate to do in, ordinary life. Now, I actually find myself doing it anyway. Um, you know, I'm the one at the cocktail party who's over in the corner talking to someone about the deep parts of their life. How does that happen? It's not like I said, let's go do deep work over in the corner. It's just that some question that I asked and the way that I was present for the answer shifted the consciousness, and all of a sudden we're in a deep state together. Nobody's calling it trance or hypnosis, but we're doing something really important in those moments. Um, yeah, moving on to that next slide that keeps trying to get here. General trance principles. And they relate to those three minds that I was talking about before. One is bringing a positive intention. Yes, we can just open to trance because we want to explore. That in itself is a positive intention. I want to explore and see what's going on under the surface of my life right now. Um, but that my cognitive mind is what establishes that intention usually. I go into it with my cognitive mind saying, there's a reason why I want to do this right now, a reason why I want to open to some kind of a creative consciousness. And that's the intention. I may state it specifically, or I may just have kind of a vague sense of what's going on here that's inspiring me to do this work right now in this moment. And then centering. It's where I connect to what's happening in my somatic being. It's where I begin to relax and find my way into into that coach state that Gilligan talks about, where I am centered and open and aware. And then the last positive connection that I want to have as I enter is resources. This is where, when I'm working with a client, I will try and find out beforehand, what are their resources? What helps them feel calm? What helps them feel connected to themselves? It may be that they feel most connected when their animal, their cat or their dog is on their lap and they're stroking it. It could be gardening. It could be cooking. It could be listening to music. Whatever it is, maybe, wandering in nature. If I know that beforehand, then as we're exploring, if we come upon some things that are uncomfortable, those places that would not be so easily tolerated, and that's why we don't go there in our ordinary states of consciousness. If I know what those resources are, then I can bring them in at that moment and help come back to a more centered place. So really important to know what resources we have available from inside of ourselves, from around us, the environment, from people who care about us, from our ancestors, from something in our spiritual or religious connections. We want to know those resources so that they're right there holding us as we create that container that's safe enough to go exploring in. And then the the Ericksonian creative utilization principles, which I know Steve Gilligan often talks about how all of the people who studied with Erickson came out there, they all came out with different ideas about what was going on there, but they all agreed on certain things. And one of them was the idea of utilization, that whatever is going on, you use it. You're not trying to exorcise it. You're not trying to throw it away. You're trying to somehow bring it into the work that's going on, maybe bringing it into the solution to whatever the problem is. And often that is the idea that is so surprising, is that the problem is often contains within it the solution to whatever it is that's needed. And the other part of that is that often the solution that someone was trying to apply is the problem at that point. So problem and solution are interesting concepts, and they're not just opposites in the way that we tend to think. One piece of all that utilization is welcoming whatever shows up, welcoming and including every single part of what's there rather than being afraid of them or feeling like they're not okay. There's something in each one that is meaningful and that we want to find a way to have a relationship with. Holding opposites is another piece of that. And this is one that I explore a lot with movement, exploring opposites. So I will hardly ever just take someone into, let's just do soft and lyrical and gentle movement. I'm going to want to create a space where we can do that. And we can also do staccato, fierce, intense movement, because there's got to be room for all of it to be part of what we're doing. And there's something about working with both that may very well take us to the next step forward in where we're trying to go. And the other one is holding multiple maps or truths or perspective. There's not just one way. Often we get stuck thinking there's one way and we, for whatever reason, can't go that way. And so we're stuck. But if we've opened up the idea that there's so that now we understand that there's more than one way. There are probably many, many, many ways. And if there's a big fence or wall in the way, let's begin to look around and see how else we might find our way through here or underneath or around or over. That there are a lot of different ways to go. I'll come back to this a little bit more when I'm talking about movement. Um, So this is the one that I think has been the most important for me in guiding my movement sessions. And it was something that I had already discovered, and I loved finding out that it was an Ericksonian principle. Because what I discovered when I was guiding a room full of people moving, I might introduce an idea for them to play with. And if everybody was lying down on the ground and not moving for a while, because I'd gotten them into a relaxed state to shift their state of consciousness so that we could connect with something deeper. And then I start to get them moving. And I may notice in a room full of people that there's one person who, as soon as I gave the instruction or the invitation that they could move, was already moving. I mean, they were just, oh, good, finally I can move. And they're all over the place. They're rolling on the floor. Maybe they've already rolled up and they're jumping. Who knows? And then at the same time, there's a whole spectrum of possibilities going on, including the person who is completely still and not moving at all. And I learned a long time ago that if I didn't create a space for multiple possibilities, then one of those people was going to feel like they were doing it wrong. And none of them were doing it wrong. They were all doing exactly what they're being needed at that moment. So I often introduce the possibilities. It's like, and as you're exploring what it feels like to be in your body here on the ground, you may find that you're moving all over the room. Or it could be that one little part of you is just beginning to twitch. Or it could be that there's no movement at all externally. but you're maybe noticing that there is movement inside of you because there is always movement going on inside of you, the fluids that are moving and the breath that is moving you gently to allow breath to come in and to leave. So I have now provided room for all kinds of possibilities of how they might interpret the the bit of guidance that I gave for what's next and what we're exploring. And then I'm looking, if I'm with a group and everybody's up and moving, I may go in a particular direction with that because I'm taking the feedback from who I'm working with to see where we go next, which is why I may have a general idea where I'm going, but I almost never use a script because I don't know what's going to happen once I get people opened up. And I want to be able to be responding to them rather than trying to drag them around into my idea of what we should be doing. So I'm going to move a little faster here because I want to get to one part towards the end here. But these are three energies or patterns in generative trance. Again, this is from Steve Gilligan. Relaxation, concentration and focus, and play. This is just the general trance practice that, and again, this comes from Steve's work. Of how to start, where you're going, all the pieces you want to have in there, and the kind of juicy part of where things can move is you really can experience whatever it is that you're trying to experience at the same time that you're working with all of what you find when you get in there. What I wanted to get to, though, is presence, because when I talked about using the feedback of who I'm working with to see where we go next, it really involves me being present. The guide has to be present for the work, present for all of what you had in mind when you came in, hoping to present to or guide people through, and present to what's actually there in the room with the person who you're working with. It means that we need to do this work for ourselves to be really fully in the moment and attuned, and to be able to bring ourselves back again and again to that centering, because we can get pulled off, we can get distressed by what's going on, we can have a reaction to something that gets said or something that happens. And we want to always be able to find our way back, to be able to notice that we're off center and say, oh, okay, let me bring myself back. So our practices, our own self practices that we do on our own, are in service of being able to be really present when we're sitting with another person or a group of people. And here I'm working a lot with the work from Geller, who has done some wonderful work around therapeutic presence. Definitely worth exploring if you've never come across that. And I have references, and you will get these slides if you want them, so you can have those references. But therapeutic presence involves being grounded in oneself while receptively taking in the verbal and nonverbal expressions of the client's in the moment experience. And that is easily said and really, really challenging for us to do ongoingly. It really does take a lot of practice. It's something that I work with a lot when I'm teaching with movement of how do I come back to myself, and then how do I reach out and connect to another and still stay centered in myself? That's a lot to do, and it's not something we're taught in our ordinary life, but it is, I think, the essence of the work that we do when we're working with another person. So a little bit about that: grounding and immersion and expansion and being with and for the client if we're working with a client, or with our students if we're working with students. participants in workshops. That's where I started, was with working with groups. I didn't get to individuals until later on. And then looking at what is it that keeps us from being fully present. And these are all the things that get in the way: our fears, our projections, our idea that we have to be objective and separate from, and that boundaries mean walls rather than something that gives us enough permeability to take in what's going on for the person we're working with, at the same time that we have a clear sense of me and them. But also our own struggles with stress, fatigue, burnout, lack of self-care, overworking, unresolved personal issues. All of those things can get in the way of our being able to be present for someone. And so they all require us to pay attention to our own state of creative consciousness, and what it takes for us to come to the work from that place. And the three energies or qualities, these are fun to think about. I know for most of us, there's one or two that are easier and often one that's more challenging. For me, tenderness came fairly easily. Fierceness I had to work on. I had to learn how to be fierce, how to have the kind of intensity, how to have the willingness to go into difficult places with people, challenging places, but still to hold it with tenderness. And then the playfulness was definitely the hardest one for me, I think. Um, just being able to know when it's appropriate to bring in humor and when humor is a distraction from the deep work. And then the last slide, I think it is, that I want to, well, almost the last slide. Yeah, the last slide I want to bring in here is that all of this is about creating a safe space or sacred space to do this work, because people won't open to these places unless it feels safe enough. Oddly, I have found that sometimes people feel safer in a group setting to do the kind of movement work that I like to do with people than if they're just alone with me, because it feels really intense to be witnessed by one person who's just watching you. In a group, often people feel like, oh, I can get lost in the group. She's not going to see me because everybody else is moving too. And so it doesn't feel as vulnerable. But whether it's a group or whether it's a person alone, I'm trying to create a safe space and look at the things that do that. And one of them is my own presence and my own openness to accepting whatever comes, my own ability to self-regulate so that my limbic system can connect to the limbic systems of whoever I'm working with, and we can all come back to a centered place together. All of these things. And I'm awful, these days, over the years, I've really learned a lot more about trauma sensitivity and inviting participants to engage at whatever level is right for them, to not feel pressured to go beyond what feels right for them in the moment, to be willing to try things, but to really learn to listen in to what's right in the moment, and to know that there will be other times, and it doesn't have to all pour out all at once. We can explore at whatever pace is right for each person. So yeah, I am gonna go to the last slide. I had a possibly art credits slide, and I have a references slide, and then I'm gonna end my slideshow and see if there are questions or thoughts or anything anybody wants to bring in.